All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for joining us today. If this is your first time, welcome to SD 101 by the San Diego History Center. And if you've already seen these, you're back, welcome back. And a big shout out to our members who make these programs possible. So today is San Diego 101. This session is Growing Balboa Park Coastal Scrub to Garden Fair with our guest speaker, Nancy Carroll Carter. Nancy is a historian and frequent community speaker who researches the development of Balboa Park, horticulture and landscape history, and the life and work of Kate Sessions. She is the associate editor of California Garden Magazine and is a director of the San Diego Floral Association. Nancy is also a member of Forever Balboa Park's Horticultural Committee and Park Improvement Committee. We will have you with us today till 1 p.m. Nancy will present her talk, and then we should have some time at the end for questions. A couple reminders before we get started. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A function, and you can put questions in there as they come to you. We will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the talk. Please feel free throughout the presentation to use the chat to say hello, make a comment, share a story or connection, but use the Q&A function for questions only so that we don't miss any. If you require closed captioning, please activate it using the CC button on the bottom of your screen. This presentation is being recorded, so sometime in the next few days, it will be posted on the San Diego History Center's YouTube channel, which I will put in the chat shortly. But we are going to go ahead and get started with our talk with Growing Balboa Park. So Nancy, when you're ready, go ahead and take it from there.
Well, hello. I'm so pleased to join you today to talk about the early history and landscaping of Balboa Park. We're going to explore the park's earliest years, leading up to the time when the 1915 Panama-California Exposition changed the park forever and set the tone for its future landscaping. We'll look at the founding of the park and some of the problems and threats to the park in its early years. You will hear about efforts to plant and improve the park and the park's first formal landscape plans. I'll describe why an exposition seemed like such a good idea in San Diego and how two accidental landscapers transformed parkland into a wildly popular landscape that defined the 1915 exposition as a garden fair and influenced the look of Southern California for a century. I'm going to close with some comments on how the exposition changed Balboa Park and influenced landscapes across California. Let's first talk about how this public park came into existence, and then look at some of the threats, uncertainties, and indignities of its early years. This map shows the 1,400-acre park within the city limits. The red X's along that line mark the edge of town, and if you've ever driven on Boundary Street, you know exactly where that is. This is a very big park, even today. It's bigger than New York Central Park. San Diego was able to create such a large public park because it was land rich in the early days. The city controlled 48,000 acres of public land after California became a state. So, unlike the situation in New York City with Central Park, land did not have to be purchased to make our city park. Originally, the park was intended to be a big square, but just before the land designation was complete, 40 acres on the lower edge were purchased by Isabella Carruthers for $175, taking that bite out of the southwest corner. And so in 1868, San Diego had its public park of 1,400 acres set aside in its natural state. This is Cabrillo Canyon. There was no talk of doing anything with the park at that time. No money was earmarked for park development. No gardeners were hired. It was just a reserved expanse of land with the simple name City Park. There was a state law passed in 1870 endorsing this use of public land, and guaranteeing that the land would forever be San Diego's public park. But despite the state law, land sharks were aggressively circling San Diego's new public park, trying to convince the city council to sell pieces of the park for development. In the worst assault, a cabal of politicians and real estate developers conspired to take over all the land of the park. When their plot was exposed, they were colorfully labeled a ring of public marauders. That trustworthy-looking fellow is Senator McCoy. San Diego's big park could have been snatched away in 1871. It was saved by citizen action. But despite this big scandal, the people who wanted to carve off pieces of the park did not give up. And they still haven't to this very day. Worse, park raiders have sometimes gotten cooperation from the very officials who are supposed to be protecting the park for the public. In 1881, just 10 years after the marauders failed in their land grab, the city council cheerfully handed over 20 acres of the park to build San Diego's first high school near downtown. A much larger school, nicknamed the Gray Castle, replaced the Russ School in 1907, illustrating what happens when non-park activities get a hold on park land. Things grow and expand beyond the original footprint. The Gray Castle was followed by many other buildings constructed around the school. But the high school was just one of a series of non-park uses of park land that were proposed or allowed. Residents living near the park managed to fend off an effort to bring in milk cows and start a dairy on the southwest edge of the park. A member of the city council was found to be growing a big field of tomatoes in the park to sell to a local cannery. About the same time, the United States Army was turned back when it proposed exchanging its downtown barracks for almost half the land in City Park. More successful was the request of a prominent banker for parkland to use for charitable purposes. City officials turned over 100 acres for a boys' orphan home and training school. This large Queen Anne building was constructed to house the school. It was in our park, and it was constructed by the banker and his partners in this charitable venture. Advocates for homeless and abused women stepped right up and got an additional 5 acres in the park to build a home for indigent women. The south end of the park became known as the Charity Tract. This transfer of parkland was very controversial. And eventually, most of the land did revert back to the city when the banker was ruined in a financial collapse and could no longer support his charity. This lovely building fell into disrepair and burned, but the Woman's Building was in the park until the 1950s. And that foothold was used to insert other buildings along the south side of the park. Next came a fraternal order wanting 30 acres to create an old age home. The city council was more than willing to hand over a piece of the park, but the newspaper helped mobilize public opinion against it. The Knights had to retreat and give up the battle. Next came a scheme for starting a tobacco plantation in the park. The city council actually approved this, but there was a public outcry, and that idea was mercifully dropped. Supporters of putting in an observatory in the park were rebuffed, as was the fire department's push to add a fire station in the park. Even the high-minded supporters of a new public library for San Diego wanted to build it in the park. But fortunately, when this lovely building was constructed in 1902, they had found other land in downtown San Diego. Well, by this time, with no park development going on, some people actually started calling the park a liability. They said it was just too big. It could never be developed for public use as a park. a letter to the editor of the San Diego Union newspaper called the park a scab on the city of San Diego, a worthless and unattractive liability. To counter this naysaying, there were various citizen-led projects to improve the park. One of the most organized efforts was by the Ladies' Annex of the Chamber of Commerce, which raised private money in 1885 to improve a large section of the park along 6th Avenue. They did a nice job, but their efforts came to grief. Vandals destroyed the benches and arbors, and people living nearby brought their horses and cows into the park after dark to feast on the 700 newly planted trees and shrubs. And finally, a drought doomed all the new plantings. There were also tree clubs formed. They collected $1 per month from members and used that money to plant trees in City Park. San Diego's first golf course was built in the park. It was all dirt, and the so-called greens were oiled areas, but they did show that the park had recreational potential. By far the most successful and lasting work was done on the southeast corner of the park near the wealthy downtown neighborhood of Golden Hill. This old postcard shows newly planted trees in what was called Golden Hill Park, which continues to be a very nicely developed area of Balboa Park. During these years, San Diego's famous horticulturalist and nursery owner, Kate Olivia Sessions, was a leading advocate for the park, and in 1889, she presented the first comprehensive plan for planting the entire park. She made her plan simple and hoped it would be cheap enough for the stingy city council. But her plan was not funded. 3 years later, and with the encouragement of park supporters, Kate Sessions moved her nursery into the park. It was at the northwest corner near today's 6th and Upas. This was in 1892 and involved a special lease with the city of San Diego. You may be familiar with this unusual arrangement. Kate was to pay her rent by planting 100 trees per year in the park, and she had to provide 300 trees annually to the city for planting in other public areas. I think the best way to think about this arrangement is as something of a demonstration, and Kate herself said she wanted to create an experimental garden. Kate Sessions would show that with her nursery grounds, that the park could be developed and improved. With cultivation, beautiful trees and plants could grow there. Here are some people enjoying the roses blooming at the Kate Sessions nursery. During the year, as various types of flowers bloomed in her nursery, she invited San Diegans to come to City Park to see the park in bloom. She really helped people have an idea of what it might be like to have a better developed park. And Kate Sessions carried out the first sustained tree plantings in the park with her 100 trees per year for 10 years. She obviously had a permanent impact on the park, and her planting and advocacy earned her the title, the Mother of Balboa Park. She introduced and popularized many different trees as she diligently sought species appropriate for the local climate. Kate Sessions helped many San Diegans understand the potential of their park as a city asset. But 30 years after the park was established, the usefulness of preserving all 1,400 acres was still being debated. Yet, nothing moved the city council to act for the benefit of the park. Finally, 1902 became a turning point because there was an outside intervention that completely changed the fortunes of our park. California historian Kevin Starr wrote about the power of chambers of commerce to bring about change in cities across the state in the late 1800s and at the turn of the 20th century. An early example in San Diego is when businessman and civic activist Julius Wagenheim proposed that the Chamber of Commerce take on a park improvement project. The Chamber seized the initiative in regard to park management and development with little or no protest from the city government. The most important subcommittee of the Park Improvement Committee was the Park Plans Group. Their job was to secure a comprehensive plan for the development of the park designed by a professional landscape architect. The work of the committee was greatly increased by the hiring of Mary B. Coulston, a really interesting person. And there is an article about her in the Journal of San Diego History if you want to learn more. She worked on the very famous publication Garden and Forest for a number of years. This was the leading publication discussing landscape, architecture, gardening, architecture, and forestry in the United States. She wrote dozens and dozens of articles here in San Diego on behalf of the Park Improvement Committee, helping San Diegans learn why they needed to keep their park, why they needed to develop their park, all the benefits that they would get from the development of their park. She reported to George Marston in her work, and to show him her work, she compiled all of her published newspaper articles into scrapbooks. And Mary B. Coulston's scrapbooks are in the San Diego History Center archives. It's really interesting to read all of these articles she was writing to help sell San Diegans on the idea of investing and keeping their park. She was also the one who suggested the name of the person who became the main landscape architect, and that is Samuel Parsons Jr. She knew him in New York. She helped edit articles he wrote for Garden and Forest, and she brought him to the attention of the Park Plans Committee. Well, Samuel Parsons was visited by George Marston when Marston was making a business trip to the East Coast, and Marston hired him and personally paid the $10,000 fee for Parsons to design San Diego's park. Parsons came to San Diego in late 1902 and found the park to be beautiful. He did not try to overlay some standard park design upon it. Rather, he advised San Diego to make a unique regional statement with its park and suggested leaving it in its natural state as much as possible. He saw the unique genius of the natural landscape and the views that were visible from the park. Do not try to make this look like a park in London, Paris, or New York, he said. Do not try to turn it into a botanical garden. Just build some roads and trails, create some enhanced entrances, and highlight canyon features with the judicious planting of trees suited to the local climate. 19th century industrialization polluted the air and elevated noise levels in cities, causing Samuel Parsons and landscape architects at the turn of the 20th century to emphasize that urban parks were a vitally important alternative to city life. Parks should be peaceful oases of nature, a place to breathe clean air, escape from stress and city noises, and from the intrusions of man-made objects and structures. This philosophy is reflected in Parsons' simple plan for the park: a few curving roads and trails that follow the natural contours of the land, and a fairly simple planting plan. There could be some formal gardens with colorful flowers at the south end of the park near downtown, but he discouraged the introduction of too many artificial features and was very opposed to locating buildings within the park. In 1903, Parsons sent his partner, George Cook, to oversee road construction and create the first formal park entrances according to the Parsons plan. He quickly got the work underway. I had seen this particular photograph for a number of years before I knew what these guys were doing. They are lighting dynamite fuses because dynamite was the only way to deal with some parts of the recalcitrant soil of Balboa Park. So dynamite was an important city park landscape tool. George Cook was a talented landscape architect and civil engineer. He was very effective in carrying out the practical work of park development. The pace of the plan implementation was rapid and obvious to everyone in town. City Park was being improved at last. Well, what was the ultimate result of this intervention we've been discussing, the 1902 Chamber of Commerce power grab in the park? In a word, this intervention changed everything. Every inch of the park was in a landscape plan and therefore not surplus land, as the real estate developers kept wanting to call it. And there were landscape entrances inviting people into the park, where there were several miles of completed roads and paths. Most importantly, San Diego's city government was slowly but inexorably drawn into the affairs of the park. It became impossible for the city council to continue its prior policy of turning its back and refusing to treat the park as city business. The culmination of the Chamber of Commerce intervention came in 1905 when voters amended the city charter to send a small portion of their property taxes into a special fund for the park. With this came the appointment of San Diego's first board of park commissioners and a full institutionalization of park management. For the next few years, work on improving the park continued on a modest scale, and the Chamber of Commerce stepped aside. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, the United States had taken over one of the most ambitious and dangerous engineering projects ever conceived. A fascinated San Diego watched as the long-anticipated Panama Canal began to seem like a reality. This remote construction project was to have a profound influence on San Diego and on Balboa Park. President Theodore Roosevelt championed the idea of taking over and completing the failed French project of linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans with a canal across Central America. These cartoons show how closely he was associated with this undertaking. Teddy is single-handedly digging the canal. Some far-sighted San Diegans began to see the possibilities. They emphasized that San Diego was the first possible port of call in the United States for ships coming through the Panama Canal from the east. This could be San Diego's opportunity to become a great city of world commerce and industry and wealth. As San Diegans thought about how to exploit this opportunity and how to focus attention on their city, how could they become known as the first port of call and actually realize the future prosperity and growth that might be promised? The idea of a World's Fair took hold. It became an infectious case of exposition fever, despite a few inconvenient truths. San Diego's economy was poor. Its city public works finances were always constrained, as illustrated by their refusal to put any money into the park, as just one example. Transportation and infrastructure were still fairly primitive. But the big issue was population. San Diego just did not have very many people in 1909 compared to other cities. Despite these hard facts, San Diego was not cured of exposition fever. Far from it. In July 1909, Aubrey Davidson, president of the Chamber of Commerce, officially proposed that a San Diego exposition be held to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. Very quickly following that announcement, an exposition corporation was formed by some of the most important citizens in town. The Exposition Corporation wanted to build the exposition in City Park, and they convinced San Diegans to support public bonds by promising that the money would be used to make major landscape improvements in the park and construct a few permanent park buildings. In July 1911, a groundbreaking ceremony was held at the proposed location of the exposition at the south edge of the park near downtown. This groundbreaking event was a complete blowout in San Diego. 4 days of celebrations, including street dances, 3 days of parades, and a big Catholic mass in the park to make the link to San Diego's mission past. The parades were quite amazing for this small town. On one day, the parade had cars carrying the Catholic Church hierarchy and a separate float for each of the 21 California missions. A second parade on another day celebrated industries, workers, and civic groups in San Diego. And here is the Carpenters and Joiners Union celebrating their work in building the U.S. Grant Hotel. The third parade was a floral parade. I think this is the Ladies' Temperance Union passing by here. Well, after this extravagant groundbreaking celebration, exposition planning moved fast. Meanwhile, it was decided that City Park needed a more prepossessing and memorable name. After considering more than 40 suggested names, the park commissioners decided to honor the explorer who first saw the Pacific Ocean from the mountains of Central America. In 1910, City Park became Balboa Park. The exposition promised to use top talent to build the exposition. The Olmsted Brothers were hired to design the exposition and to make improvements throughout Balboa Park. The Olmsted Brothers by this time were the most famous landscape architecture firm in the United States. They had already designed 2 different expositions. They were the best possible choice. John Charles Olmsted at the left there came to San Diego for a fairly long stay and drew up plans for an exposition on the south end of the park near downtown and today's high school. Like Samuel Parsons, the Olmsteds believed that urban parks should be a pastoral retreat from city life, free of buildings and noise. If you were going to put a building in the park, at least put it on the fringes, at the edge of the park, so that the interior of the park remained natural open space. The Olmsted plan was immediately undermined by those who favored building the expo on the Central Mesa. The Olmsteds did not want to build in the center of the park. They predicted very accurately that this would be just the beginning of a large-scale intrusion into the peace and quiet of that part of the park. They invited San Diego to take the longer view and to protect the precious open space in the highest parts of Balboa Park and to protect the beautiful view corridors from that area. Against their advice, the exposition was moved from the south edge of the park to the Central Mesa in the configuration that we know today. The Olmsteds resigned after this decision was made. They refused to be a part of what they considered to be the ruination of Balboa Park. Like the Olmsteds, the architect chosen for the expo, Bertrand Goodhue, was a leading light in his field. When he heard about the San Diego Exposition, he wanted the job, and he really went after it, calling on all kinds of friends, all the people he knew in California. And of course, he knew the Olmsteds very well, and they also helped him get the job. Bertrand Goodhue edged out local architect Irving Gill, who originally was going to design the buildings. Irving Gill left the exposition a short time after Goodhue was brought in. Carlton Winslow was the resident architect from the Goodhue firm, and he stayed here in San Diego working on designs for the exposition and seeing that the architectural plans were carried out. The Botanical Building is one of his designs. Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. worked briefly at the exposition before moving to Los Angeles. Goodhue and Winslow were the main architects who created a fantasy land of Spanish colonial revival architecture. They looked to Spain and Mexico for their inspiration and created a style that influenced architecture across Southern California and beyond. Look carefully at this church dome and its towers. Here's a little close-up of the Tosco Church and, of course, our own California building in Balboa Park. The first exposition construction was the Cabrillo Bridge and the administration building. And here's the beginning of the Botanical Building. It looks just about like this right now at this stage of its reconstruction. So the architecture was coming along, but what about the landscape? What happened after the Olmsted Brothers resigned and left San Diego? To have these famous landscape architects pull out was a blow and extremely embarrassing. Frank P. Allen, the exposition director of works, volunteered to take over landscaping responsibility, partially because he was one of the people who wanted to move the exposition and help force out the Olmsteds. Frank Allen also promoted a low-level employee to become his right-hand assistant. I call these two the accidental landscapers of the Panama-California Exposition. They were hired for other jobs, but ended up being in charge of landscaping. Fortunately for the exposition, they were both 30-something workaholics with talent and excellent organizational skills. Frank P. Allen was another of the best hired for the exposition. He was a brilliant architect and engineer and project manager. He had been director of works at two different expositions. At the Seattle Exposition in 1909, he completed the building 7 months ahead of schedule and under budget. He was the best, but when he was hired as director of works in San Diego, locals were outraged about his $20,000 annual salary. He had pushed to relocate the exposition, as I mentioned, in opposition to the Olmsteds. He never dreamed that they would resign, but when they did, he felt he had to pick up the slack and take responsibility for the landscaping. He knew absolutely nothing about landscaping or plants and had been living in Washington and Oregon before coming to this much more arid part of the world. Fortunately, the other person he hired to work on landscaping did know a lot about plants and landscape design. Paul George Thien was an ambitious immigrant who had been in the United States for a few years, but had not yet found a permanent direction. He came to San Diego in 1910 and started a nursery in Old Town called the Ramona Nursery. Just as his money was running out, as the nursery did not flourish. He got a job as a sub-foreman at the exposition nursery that had just been created by the Olmsteds. He was promoted to supervise that nursery when the Olmsted employees left, and promoted again by Frank P. Allen to be superintendent of exposition landscape. He rode around on his horse while supervising the large crews who were working on the exposition grounds. And another thing to notice here is they are already setting out these trees, getting ready to plant the trees so that they could get some size to them before all these buildings were completed and the exposition opened. One of the first things the Olmsteds did when they were hired for the exposition was to start clearing and plowing the virgin soil of the park, and it was awfully hard work. They also immediately created an exposition nursery to grow the millions of plants that were going to be needed to decorate the exposition grounds. He's very hard to see, but right here is Paul Thien inside one of the exposition nursery shade houses where they're obviously growing all these ferns. The exposition nursery appealed to the people of San Diego, to the gardeners of San Diego, to donate plant clippings. And this was one of the ways that they were going to start growing the plants that they already knew could do well in San Diego. It was estimated that more than 2 million plants were going to be grown and needed for the exposition. They also found out that people were willing to donate some large trees. So I love this picture of this large palm making its way from somewhere downtown past the Gray Castle School and into the park where it was planted in the exposition grounds. This person under the green arrow here is Frank Sessions, the brother of Kate Sessions. And Frank Sessions had a special job at the exposition. He was their expert on moving large trees and getting them planted in the exposition grounds. Here's another large tree that was donated to the exposition. And if you look here, you see that some of those smaller trees that we saw in the boxes are already growing and starting to take shape. The buildings were completed 1 month early, and excitement in San Diego was over the top as the date approached for the opening of this exposition. Think about it. In the making since 1909, and the biggest event in San Diego history. It was scheduled to officially open in the first minute of 1915. So at midnight, let me go back and just show, I forgot I put in this slide. This is such a fantastic illustration. They are using this crude construction to lift large trees down into the canyon beside the bridge. So as soon as the bridge could be used, and I'll show you just a close-up. So these holes have already been created, and here's one tree already in place. Now, the idea of this is that they wanted these trees to grow up around the bridge and around the whole exposition so that it looked like this magical city was just rising out of this forest. Here again, you can see they're getting these trees in right away. So it's December 31st, 1914. All of this work is finally coming to fruition. The grounds of the exposition are packed with people on the night of December 31st, 1914. And back in Washington, D.C., someone at the White House needed to wake up Woodrow Wilson, the president, who pressed a button that started the telegraph wires humming all the way across the country to the far west. And then the dazzling lights of the Panama-California Exposition blazed into the night sky. The exposition was underway with all the changes for San Diego and our park. So let's take a look. If you wanted to come to the exposition, one of the first things you would find is this rose garden, which was actually not on the exposition grounds. It was on the other side of the bridge, closer to 6th Avenue. I've always loved this particular tinted picture done by an obviously botanically challenged colorist, because this is a rose garden, and I don't think we've seen too many blue roses. But it gives you the idea that there was a lovely garden that was the first thing people saw as they crossed the bridge to go into the exposition. It was 207 million people came into the exposition during 1915 and 1916, when it was extended for 1 year. The exposition grounds were beautiful. There were forested areas like this that's hard to imagine this even being in Balboa Park. There were special gardens, and of course this is Alcazar Garden, and at that time Montezuma Garden. This was one of the quiet gardens where you could come and kind of get a break from the hustle and bustle of the exposition. From the main Plaza de Panama, you could go off in any direction and find special landscaping. They planted bougainvillea in flower boxes at the tops of the buildings, and other vines, so these colorful flowers were draping off the buildings. And this is a very special story. These poor poinsettias here, I've never found a better photograph of these. But one of the things that they wanted to do as a matter of publicity is to have a very colorful display of flowers when the exposition opened on January 1st. This was a message to all those people back in Chicago and Pittsburgh who were freezing on January 1st, that if you were in San Diego, you would be in a land of sunshine and beautiful flowers. So for the opening of the exposition, they planted 10,000 poinsettia bushes. And of course, these are the old-fashioned large poinsettia bushes, the native ones. And the other message of this was that the red and yellow flowering and bracts symbolize the colors of the flag of Spain, red and yellow, the official exposition colors. You can see these trees have got, these black acacias have done very nicely. They've grown up into a reasonable size. We've got more flowers draped on the buildings. And Paul Thien liked to do these special group plantings. He was very talented at putting together these attractive groups of plantings. The Botanical Building is once again going to look very much like this when its current restoration is completed. They're going to restore these surrounding stucco that had been removed back in an earlier restoration. It was a beautiful site, and people absolutely loved this exposition. One of the things we don't know about today is that from the back of the Botanical Building, there was a glass house. So back in that glass house, there were even more exotic plants than were being grown out in the Botanical Building itself. From the Botanical Building, you could go back to the Japanese tea house and garden. And then this was probably the most stylized formal garden of the entire exposition. This was the garden of the Southern California Counties building. And right here was planted the Morton Bay fig tree that is growing in this area today. They were trying to convince people that San Diego and Southern California was a great place to live. So this wasn't just about developing a port, it was also about just advertising the area for other settlers. So one of the ways they did that was by creating this model farm. They handed out all the list of the things you could grow on this very small acreage, and they also had a model orchard of citrus trees. The Lipton tea people were there growing tea in the park. And just about any place you went, you found a nice landscape. They filled Palm Canyon with palm trees, and there was a lovely walk through Palm Canyon. Frank P. Allen happened to love all kinds of arbors, and there were many of them built throughout, covered with flowering vines. And as they like to say, they had ransacked the world for specimens of rare plants to put into the exposition grounds. Again, showing people that anything would grow in Southern California. Come here, buy 1 acre of soil, and you can support yourself and your family. The decoration and landscape of the exposition was important enough that it was included in the official guidebook. So Paul Thien, superintendent, wrote up a list of all the trees and plants that were planted in the exposition grounds. It took 25 pages to list everything in the official guidebook. Well, the exposition was a great success, so much so that it was extended for that extra year. By proving that tiny San Diego could successfully pull off a major event, the exposition did enhance civic pride tremendously. The beautifully landscaped grounds of the exposition demonstrated the horticultural potential of Balboa Park and our entire region. Articles about the expo were published in almost every national magazine, and praise for the landscape was unstinting. It was a new Garden of Eden. It must have been created by a magic wand. The grass lawns were velvet green, the flowers always abundant. There was even a book written called The Garden Fair. The story we do not hear about this landscape is that it was inspected every day for a limp or dying flower, that it was watered every morning, and that crews of workers sometimes stayed all night to replant flower beds. We do not hear that the two accidental landscapers had almost no experience in Southern California landscaping and had most recently both lived on the well-watered coasts of Oregon and Washington. We do not hear that the landscaping of just 640 acres of the exposition grounds cost almost $10 million in today's money. Finally, we rarely take note that in creating the Panama-California Exposition, an unsustainable and water-dependent landscape style was popularized in Southern California. For the next century, we confused our Mediterranean frost-free climate with a tropical zone. But we, of course, are missing the rains of the tropics. The beautiful exposition landscape ignored the expertise of Sessions, Parsons, and Olmsted, who had collectively advised us to use native plants, to look to similar climates for new plants, to make a regional statement, not to overplant, to avoid grassy lawns, and to keep man-made structures out of the park. Well, whatever the historical missteps, we love our Balboa Park and its 1915 legacy. Right now, we anticipate the horticultural renewal promised by the renovation of the Botanical Building and its surrounding gardens. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Nancy, for that presentation. I learned a lot of new things. We don't currently have any questions yet, but maybe as I'm speaking, people will use the Q&A function to ask any questions. I just put in the chat box a few links if you are curious. If you are interested in watching past SD 101s, if you scroll down to past programs, there's a link to our YouTube channel. We are going to be continuing with our SD 101 webinar series every second Tuesday of the month at 12 p.m. Next month, on October 11th, for our SD 101 is a presentation on Borrego Springs mid-century modern architecture by our CEO and publisher of BorregoModern.com, Bill Lawrence. We are also going to be hosting a very special virtual presentation on October 26th with Dr. Rudy Guevara called Growing Up Mexipino. Dr. Guevara explores the historical and contemporary experiences of San Diego's Mexipino communities across several generations. Please look for our emails to register for those presentations. If you have not signed up for the emails, please visit our website, www.sandiegohistory.org, to sign up for those. We will wait a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, or if you have a comment or a story, you can put that in the chat. But thank you all for joining us today. Once again, thank you to our members for making these chat possible, and very thank you to Nancy for doing this great presentation. Looks like we do have one question already. So the question is, what role did the exposition have in helping J.D. Spreckels improve land sales in the region and the development of the regional water supply?
Gee, I honestly don't know the answer in terms of the regional water supply, but of course he did build his own railway that took people up to the exposition from downtown and went on over into the North Park area. And that rail line definitely had a lot to do with the development of property in the college, in the university area and in North Park. I really don't know very much about Spreckels' water development. Sorry.
Thank you. And if you do have questions like those, you could always go to our website, San Diego History Center, type in the search box. We have tons of articles and tons of information on our website. Still waiting on any more questions. Oh, another one. Does anyone feel that the eucalyptus trees are too tall and obscure the view of the California building? Should they be replaced with shorter trees when they die?
Well, I think that's going to be inevitable. I think that the park is really not planting, at least not the tall lemon-sit and gums, which are the ones that are usually the very, very tall trees in the park. Again, when you think back to when Kate Sessions was searching the world for the types of trees that might be appropriate in Balboa Park, she of course looked to eucalyptus, and it's taken a long time for us to figure out that not all those eucalyptus are the best choices for our park. So when those tall trees are gone, or when they're taken out, if they start beginning to feel dangerous, and sometimes they do just take them down because they're afraid they're going to fall, they will not be replaced with those same species for sure.
Thank you. We have another question. Once the expo ended, what happened to the flowering plants and vines which were planted on the grounds?
Well, I think you will recall that most of those exposition buildings were supposed to disappear. And of course, they ended up not being taken out. But the original idea was that the garden area that was going to be retained and maintained was the botanical building would remain, and a large garden area around the botanical building would be the main garden area of Balboa Park that was kept up. But everything changed for various reasons. One thing is that the park was used by the Navy in World War I, so that completely changed the upkeep of the park and the way that the exposition grounds were going to be used. The one garden in the formal gardens we saw that did manage to be maintained was the one that I pointed out that was the most formally designed garden, the one that had all the different flower beds. That garden was maintained up until the 1970s. But most of those others, you know, they stopped having the draping bougainvillea on the buildings and so on. They just did not have the upkeep for that. They did by that time have John Morley as the head of the parks, and John Morley, of course, kept up the areas of the former Rose Garden, and the areas near 6th Avenue and so on continued to be maintained. But the Navy occupied a good part of the central part of the park right after the exposition, not long after the exposition.
Okay, thank you. It looks like those are the only questions that we
Okay.
have. So thank you once again to Nancy for doing this really wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining on presentation. Please look for emails for the next presentation in October, and hopefully we will see you all then. So goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.